Some evidence is straightforward, like DNA, fingerprints, a murder weapon. And then there's the other kind. Things so strange investigators might miss them at first, but in the end, they're what holds the secret to busting a case wide open. Well, welcome to Scary Mysteries. Here are 5 bizarre clues behind real-life horror stories. Number 5. Tokyo's most meticulous murder. The sun had barely risen on April 23rd of 1994 in Tokyo, when a janitor working the morning shift in Inokashira Park began his usual rounds. One after another, he emptied out the trash bins filled with the usual food wrappers and soda cans until he came across one that was oddly heavy. Inside this particular bin was a large plastic bag tied multiple times to ensure it stayed closed. The curiosity got the better of him, and when he opened it, that's when he saw something that would change him forever. Severed human limbs. The police arrived and began their investigation, and as it turns out, this wasn't the only bag that was thrown away. They discovered a total of 27 body parts, each carefully discarded and distributed across multiple bins in the park. And each piece, roughly 20 centimeters long, had been cut with near surgical precision. So, whoever did this wasn't sloppy, and they weren't nervous. They were calculated, deliberate, and terrifyingly skilled. The victim was a 35-year-old male architect. Authorities referred to him publicly only as S. He lived close by, not too far from that park. His life on the surface was ordinary, an educated professional living alone, but as investigators peeled back the layers, they discovered something darker hiding in plain sight. And first, the details of the dismemberment. Now, the body had been completely drained of blood, and that's not something just anyone can do. You need a large water supply, and far beyond what a typical home setup could provide, and precise anatomical knowledge to pull it off. The forensics believed the killer used an electric saw, but not haphazardly. The muscle tissue had been cleanly cut, the kind of job you'd expect from someone in medicine or somebody trained to make people disappear. The man's fingers and toes had been deliberately mutilated, his fingerprints scraped away, but the killer missed a few, and that's how police eventually confirmed the victim's identity. His torso and chest were never found. The theory here was that janitorial staff may have unknowingly removed some of those bags the day before, but no one could confirm that. Those remains were simply gone. As police began reconstructing S's final hours, they were met with dead ends and contradictions. According to one unconfirmed eyewitness, S had been attacked by 2 men near a department store the night before he vanished, though there were no signs of blunt trauma on his body. Another claimed to see 2 men carrying plastic bags through the park around 4 a.m., but they were just a couple of regular-looking guys, and the eyewitness didn't know they were carrying a body out there, if in fact that's what they were doing. Really, the only thing the authorities could tell was that this wasn't just a random murder. It was a planned execution, and to the point where they went to so much trouble to clean up and cut the body that they felt confident enough to dump it right in public. If it got thrown away, great, but if it was found, which it was, well, who cares? It won't get traced back to the killers. And it wasn't. As to why it happened, one early possibility was that it was revenge. Maybe a former lover, someone close to S, or even a colleague. But police interviewed friends, co-workers, and acquaintances, and no motive ever emerged. Another theory involved a religious organization that S had been a part of. Details about the group were sparse, and authorities never publicly named it, but speculation brewed that S may have either betrayed them or threatened to leave. Still again, no concrete link, just a strange lead with no follow-through. The one theory that seemed to stick, and the one investigators kept circling back on, was organized crime. Because let's face it, Only an outfit with the right resources could carry out a killing this clean. And in 2015, over 20 years after the murder, a man going by the name K came forward with a shocking story that might prove the investigators were on the right track. CK had run a warehouse business near S's home. He was well known in the local street vendor scene and, by his own admission, wasn't friendly to foreign vendors moving into the area. He'd even used intimidation tactics to drive some of them out. But one vendor didn't back down. Unbeknownst to Kay, this vendor allegedly had ties to a foreign criminal syndicate. And soon after, Kay began noticing signs he was being watched. Vehicles were parked outside, and strangers loitered around his business. Fearful, he checked into a hotel under a false name and laid low. And then came the news reports. A man had been murdered near his home, a man who resembled him very closely and who lived in the same neighborhood. And that's when it clicked. Had the killers mistaken S for K? And K was convinced they had, but terrified of retaliation, he kept quiet for over 2 decades, eventually changing his line of work completely. If K was right, then S wasn't targeted for who he was or what he had done, but for who someone thought he was. A fatal case of mistaken identity. Number 4. DNA doesn't lie. On the night of November 29, 2012, 66-year-old Ravi Kumra was attacked inside his lavish 7,000 square foot Montecito mansion in Silicon Valley. And Kumra was a wealthy businessman, a former owner of an upscale winery, and a prominent figure in the community, so the perfect target for anyone desperate enough for cash. His mouth was duct taped shut and his hands tied up. His girlfriend, Harinder, was asleep upstairs, and she woke up to multiple men tying and taping her up before carrying her down. The house was then turned upside down, and jewelry, cash, and valuables were stolen. When they left, Harinder managed to break free of her restraints and call 911. She was in a frantic state of panic, but it wasn't so much because of the break-in at this point. It was because Ravi was dead. He had suffocated to death, and that tape covering his nose and mouth was just too tight. But from the jump, police felt like this wasn't a random break-in, and his place seemed to have been cased well, as the intruders had knowledge of the layout, the safe and surveillance system. There was a level of sophistication to the whole thing. The evidence they left behind at the crime scene was scarce. The real break in the case they were looking for came after Ravi's autopsy was completed. Under his fingernails, likely from the struggle, was a full DNA profile of one of the men involved. It came back to 26-year-old Lucas Anderson, a homeless man with a minor criminal history. Now, he'd had past encounters with the law, mostly petty crimes and nothing violent, so this was a pretty big step up in his game, so to speak. Lucas was quickly arrested and charged with kidnapping, robbery, and murder. As he sat behind bars staring down the death penalty, he claimed innocence all along, but DNA doesn't lie. Except, in this case, it did.
Hey, Charlie, you a crime?
Yeah.
For what?
Wonder. Your DNA was found at our crime scene on our victim. Starting to ring some bells?
I don't know what you guys talking about. I don't.
His public defenders started combing through records. That's when they found something big. So on the night Ravi was killed, Lucas had been hospitalized. And he had been picked up by paramedics in downtown San Jose, suffering from acute alcohol intoxication. He was unresponsive when he was brought to the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center and remained there for over 12 hours, from around 6:30 p.m. on November 29th to the following morning. His blood alcohol level was so high, doctors believed he could have died. Nurses checked on him regularly, and he was never left alone. In other words, he physically couldn't have been at the crime scene. And so then, how did his DNA end up on the victim? As investigators kept digging, they discovered that the same paramedics who treated Lucas earlier that day were also dispatched to the crime scene at the mansion later that night. So the same EMTs who had touched Anderson's skin, placed tubes in his mouth, and moved his body, later touched Ravi. DNA doesn't require a lot to transfer, just a few skin cells, a little sweat, a residue from a tube or glove. In a moment of accidental cross-contamination, Lucas Anderson's genetic material was then transferred to Ravi's body. The crime lab didn't catch it, and the police didn't question it, and no one considered the possibility of secondary DNA transfer. That is, until Lucas's alibi at the hospital made the charges unravel. When the truth came out, the case against Lucas Anderson collapsed. After spending 5 months in jail, he was released and exonerated. Authorities eventually charged 3 other men in the case who had previously visited Kumra's mansion, and they were convicted, and justice, it seemed, had been served. Lucas filed a lawsuit. His case became a rallying cry for forensic reform and ignited widespread discussion among legal experts, scientists, and civil rights advocates. Because the framing of Lucas Anderson wasn't the work of corrupt cops or scheming killer, it was an accident. A terrifying example of how easy it is for DNA to mislead.
DNA evidence, when done properly, is solid evidence. But when we say things like, can we trust it? It's not can we trust the science if science is done well. It's can we trust juries and people to interpret it properly.
We're always told DNA is infallible, that it tells the truth, that it's science. But what this case showed, that DNA doesn't always prove guilt. It sometimes just proves contact. Number 3, the Lego case. They found her on the floor of her quiet suburban home, bloodied, beaten, and barely recognizable. A pillow had been placed over her face, maybe out of guilt or maybe just to dehumanize her even further. Lucille Johnson was 78 years old, a grandmother who baked for her neighbors and visited the sick, the type of woman you'd never expect to make enemies, let alone become the victim of one of Utah's most brutal murders. The year this went down was 1991, during the wintertime in Holiday, Utah. Lucille's daughter had stopped by her mom's for a visit when she found her on that floor. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull, 24 broken ribs, and a barrage of blows to the head. And whoever did this didn't just want her dead, they wanted her obliterated. And yet, the crime scene here held one puzzling detail that stood out among the chaos. Lego pieces all over the place. And they were scattered around the entryway, lying untouched in the living room. A few were even found out in the driveway, as if dropped by a kid mid-step. At most, this wouldn't have been too noteworthy, just a messy house, but anyone who knew Lucille knew better. She was the type to keep her home spotless. Now, she kept Legos in her home for when the grandkids visited, but her daughter told detectives plainly she would never leave toys on the floor like that. For detectives, the detail was interesting and worth noting, but ultimately useless. The crime was never solved, and for the next 2 decades, that's how it stayed.
Since 1991, Lucille Johnson's savage beating death has been a mystery. No word about who could have done it. It was apparently someone she had let inside her own home.
But fast forward to 2013, the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office had begun re-examining old evidence using new DNA technology. Among the preserved items, fingernail scrapings from Lucille's body and some of those mysterious Lego bricks. Now, the DNA under her fingernails came back with a match to a criminal already behind bars. His name was John Sansing, and he was at that moment sitting on death row in Arizona for the 1998 murder of 37-year-old Elizabeth Calabrese. She was a good Samaritan who had brought his struggling family food from a church pantry, and in return, Sansing, along with his wife Kara, tied Elizabeth up in their home, stabbed and beat her with a club. And Kara later testified that while this was all going on, their 4 children were inside the house, so it's likely some of them witnessed the murder. And as it turns out, this wouldn't be the first time something like this happened. Because mixed in with the whole bloody puzzle of that 1991 crime scene in Utah were fingerprints. Not Sansing's, though, but his 5-year-old son's on those Lego pieces. So as it turns out, Sansing had brought his child along with him while he murdered Lucille Johnson. It painted a true picture of just how evil this man was. A person who brought their toddler to a murder scene like it was a quick errand, and left him to play while he slaughtered an elderly woman in the next room.
Case. His alleged brutality is now more clear, the sheriff describing him as barely human.
Occasionally, we run into individuals who are evil. The individual that is being charged with this crime today can only be described as that.
Authorities could never pinpoint why Sansing targeted Lucille, but they speculated it was likely a robbery gone wrong, possibly even a random act of opportunity. Lucille was the type of person who opened her door to anyone in need, so she might have welcomed Sansing inside, offered him food, a phone, maybe help. Instead, he beat her to death while his child built towers out of plastic bricks just a few feet away. Number 2, Red Bull gives you wings. You don't expect a can of Red Bull to solve a murder, but in the hills of the Scottish Highlands, that's exactly what happened. What started as a seemingly tragic disappearance of a grandfather cycling for charity would turn into one of Scotland's strangest and most shameful criminal cover-ups, one involving twin brothers, a hidden body, and a truth buried for 3 long years. And Tony Parsons was 63 years old, Navy veteran and cancer survivor, and father of 2. He had taken on a 104-mile charity bike ride in September 2017 to give back to the hospital that had treated him for prostate cancer. His journey began in Fort William and would have ended in Tillicoultry, his home, but Tony never made it. Officially, he was last seen around 11:30 p.m. at the bridge of Orchie Hotel, heading south on the A82, but after that he vanished. Everyone assumed it was an accident, so search parties combed the surrounding highlands for weeks. Eventually, without any sign of him though, they figured a crime may have occurred. So police dogs, helicopters, and drones were deployed, appeals on the local news, but everything came up empty. Unfortunately, nothing added up, and so this case grew cold. And as it turns out, what nobody knew then was that just hours after he left that hotel, Tony was struck violently by a car speeding down the dark road outside Bridge of Orchie. Behind the wheel was 25-year-old Alexander McKellar, drunk, reckless, and completely unequipped for the life or death moment that followed. Instead of stopping to help, Alexander decided to look out for himself, and he just left Tony to die before calling his identical twin brother Robert. Rather than alerting authorities, the McKellar twins returned to the scene in a different vehicle. They then loaded Tony's badly injured body into the car and drove him back to the Och Estate, a sprawling, remote piece of land where they both worked as landscapers. They knew the terrain, all those nooks and crannies that no one ventured into. And there, in the dead of night, they dug a shallow grave and buried the man. And for 3 years, that's where Tony Parsons stayed, a beloved grandfather reduced to a missing person case, a secret the McKellars seemed determined to carry to their graves. Until the mistake. In 2020, Alexander confided in his then-girlfriend. Maybe it was guilt, though possibly it was arrogance. And so much time had passed, he felt like he'd gotten away with it and wanted to look cool for his lady. Took her out to the burial site to show her where Tony's body lay. She didn't say anything at first, but she left something behind. a Red Bull can. And it wasn't trash mistakenly left, it was a marker, and weeks later she contacted the police. Investigators launched a targeted dig, and first they uncovered a fragment of red material and part of the jacket Tony had worn the night he disappeared. Over the course of 2 painstaking days, police exhumed his remains. The autopsy showed catastrophic rib, pelvis, and spine fractures. The injuries to his chest were so severe they crushed his ability to breathe. And Tony may have lived for up to 30 minutes after the crash, but he died alone, hidden by cowards.
These 2 guys probably could have saved him if they'd have reacted the way they should have reacted and called for emergency services. You know, the whole thing's disgusting for me.
In January of 2021, the McKellar twins were arrested, and in court, the brothers admitted their roles. Alexander pled guilty to culpable homicide and received 12 years. Robert, for attempting to pervert the course of justice, got 5 years and 3 months. The most disturbing thought of this whole thing is if that girlfriend hadn't spoken up. If she hadn't dropped that Red Bull can, Tony may still be listed as missing today. The grandfather's body, buried in a lonely Highland grave, almost lost to time, all because 2 brothers chose to protect themselves instead of doing the right thing. Number 1. Snowball. Prince Edward Island is a wonderful place to be in the summer and fall months. Peaceful, coastal, and charming, it's a beautiful spot. But on October 7th of 1994, that serenity was shattered. Because just outside Tin Valley on that day, police discovered a white car ditched on Highway 169. The license plates had been removed and the interior was splattered in blood, but there was no body in sight. And that vehicle belonged to 32-year-old Shirley Dugway, a mother of 5. Her family hadn't seen her in 4 days, and with news about her car and the condition it was in, panic set in quick. This didn't look like any accident. No, somebody had hurt Shirley. The RCMP launched a full-scale investigation, but for 7 long months there was no trace of Shirley, which meant no answers as to what exactly happened to her. But then, on May 6, 1995, in a wooded area of North Enmore, searchers stumbled upon a shallow grave. Inside, partially decomposed and bound at the wrists, was the body of Shirley, and she had been strangled to death. But it wasn't just the body that investigators found. Lying nearby was a plastic bag with a blood-soaked leather jacket inside, and on that jacket they pulled off 2 strands of white cat hair, and this would change everything. The police quickly zeroed in on Douglas Beamish, Shirley's estranged common-law partner and the father of 3 of her children. And their relationship had been volatile and marked by allegations of abuse and control. And there was one detail that caught everyone's attention. Douglas owned a white cat, a particularly fluffy, hard-to-miss feline named Snowball. When police looked at the jacket again, the blood was a match for Shirley, which was assumed. But what about that cat hair? Could it prove anything? At that point, no one had ever used animal DNA in a criminal investigation. The science simply didn't exist. But the RCMP were about to change that. In order to test the hairs, detectives contacted the Laboratory of Genomic Diversity in Maryland. This wasn't a crime lab by any stretch. It was a research facility that studied genetic diseases, but they agreed to help. To ensure the test was reliable, scientists needed to establish how genetically diverse the local cat population was. So they tested DNA samples from 20 random cats around Prince Edward Island. If Snowball's DNA was too common, well, the test would be meaningless. But it wasn't. The hairs from that jacket were a 100% match to Snowball, and statistically unique enough to hold up in court. And what followed was scientific history in the making.
what we discovered was that the genotype was identical to what we had seen in the jacket hair. So we were pretty sure that the jacket hair had come from a cat which had the same genotype as Snowball.
Beamish, who had denied everything, now had a major problem. Because the two were estranged, Shirley hadn't been in contact with him for several days. So how did his cat's hair get on her jacket unless he'd been there when she died? The trial made headlines. It was the first time in legal history that non-human DNA was used to convict a murderer. Beamish was found guilty of second-degree murder in '96 and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 18 years. He appealed the verdict twice, and both appeals were denied. In 2013, he tried again, this time asking for parole, but that too he didn't get. And Snowball, meanwhile, became an unlikely icon in forensic science. His genetic code had opened the door to a whole new world of investigation. And Shirley's murder was tragic and brutal, but it also left a permanent mark on criminal justice. Thanks to a cat no one expected to matter, a killer was put behind bars, and forensic science was changed forever. So there were 5 bizarre clues behind real-life horror stories. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're still here, thank you so much for tuning in. We have a lot more stories for you to check out, so feel free to dig on in. And if you want more, go check us out on Patreon for exclusive content. It's totally free to try out. You stay safe out there. I'll see you all very soon.